Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to a special episode of the Burn Your Boats podcast. Last Thursday, Hurricane Helene made its way up the west coast of Florida. And last Friday, the city and particularly the waterfront neighborhoods up and down the west coast of Florida had a new dawn, a new day of reckoning. Today, we discuss hurricanes. We discussed them in really three categories. What can home buyers and investors do before a storm hits? When they're buying a home, what are the best tips? What are the best approaches to actually buying a home, getting the right type of insurance, and understanding the elevation of your home and the location of your home in a particular neighborhood? What are the things that people do during a storm, and what does it look like the day after? Clark and I spent a few days helping friends, driving around, and we walk you through our observations of what that looked like. Finally, we talk about moving forward. What should a governmental response look like? And that's the state government, the local government, the federal government. What should the insurance response look like? And what should the individual owner's response look like? It is a fascinating episode, and it's a journey into all of these topics. So it's more nuanced and more complex than you might at first imagine. So without further ado, let's get into this gritty, intelligent, if you don't mind my saying, approach to having an honest conversation about storms and what their implications are. Because the state of Florida is not going to get any smaller. It's going to continue to grow. How it grows is what this conversation is going to look like. Well, Clark, what a week it's been. This is Clark and David coming to you from the Burn Your Boats Wealth podcast, live from the Tampa Bay area. And we are approximately 6 or 7 days past Hurricane Helene, Clark. And so, we had to interject and have a conversation about that hurricane. It's a complex topic. It's a very nuanced topic, and we're not going to get into the, politics of this, but we're going to get into the biggest question, Clark, that I ever get asked as I have traveled the country for the last 15 years, dispoing our renovated homes. And that question is, David, can you talk to me about hurricanes? And so, Clark, I've answered that question a couple of thousand times, but today we're actually going to really dig into it because it's fresh, it's live, people can see it on the news, and people can hear a sensationalist version of the story.
Right.
I don't think people are really hearing the full story. And today we're going to kind of get into that story. We're going to get, you and I have been driving around. We've got a lot of personal observations. So, Clark, that's what we're going to talk about today, Hurricane Helene. Now, before we get started, Clark, do you want to just make sure that people understand that we do not intend to be insensitive in this conversation? We do not intend to mock anybody in this conversation, but we are going to try and have an honest conversation about the situation, our personal observations, our observations before this storm, our observations after this storm, and about personal choice and personal decision making and personal action taking. And so, Clark, before we get started here, do you want to add any more to how we want to approach today's conversation in a sensitive fashion?
It is a bit of a touchy subject, right? Because we always want to bring as much value as possible. We don't want to minimize the fact that there are people right now that they don't have homes. They've lost all their things. I can just tell personally, my dad had some like antique cars, and, there's no amount of money that an insurance company is going to write a check for to replace those sentimental items. So seeing it kind of firsthand is very, very difficult. But at the same time, we've got to be able to, be sad understand what's going on, but we got to be able to get up, chest high and persevere and get through this. And I'll tell you, David, that watching the community come together has been really cool. I know that this has impacted so many different people on the Southeast, from North Carolina to Georgia to Tennessee, all these different areas that you never think that would impact. But being able to see the community kind of rally together to be able to put out housing availability, short-term rentals, to be able to say, hey, I've got this. I've seen so many posts where people are like, hey, I'm trying to help out this stranger. I've never met him before. Who wants to come meet me on a Saturday and help empty out the house, to be able to, air it out, to pull drywall, things like that. So on a positive note, David, being able to see the community rally around the people that really, really need it is motivating. It's inspiring. And you tend to really see the true colors of people during these times. So in amongst all this negativity, you're always going to see the news to show the beach house that's getting blown away in the flood and all of that. But to be able to see community and see people care and put other people in front of them, that's an amazing thing, David.
I've always said that when you're in trouble and you're in hospital, or something happens to you or a family member, it's always amazing that people who are on the absolute periphery of your life sometimes become the most instrumental and kind
Yep.
people. And some of the people who are closest to you in your absolute inner circle just really let you down. It's really interesting. And that's an observation I've had more than once in my life. And so, to your point about the community, it's incredible how people you don't know, are rallying to your
Yeah.
side. And it's incredible how people you do know are like, how are you doing? Fine. Okay, cool. You do you.
Right.
But look, we're going to have the discussion today has got some structure to it.
Yep.
We're going to have a start, a middle, and an ending. So we're going to talk about what our observations are as we drove around in the last week or two, and the people we met and the circumstances that we've personally seen. Then we're going to talk about before the storm. So what was the lay of the land before the storm hit, right? And what I mean by before the storm, I'm talking about, what decisions did people make? Where did people live? What type of houses they lived in? And so on and so forth. So we're going to have a before the storm conversation. Then we're going to have an after the storm conversation about where do we go from now? What's the future? Because the future is not bleak. The future is bright. And we're gonna have that conversation about what's going to happen in the future. And so let's start out with just personal observations. Clark, I was watching your social media all weekend, and indeed I was on a phone to your father
Yeah.
on Thursday night as he was trying to figure out, should he go down into the garage and flick his breaker box, and would he kill himself as he put his foot in the water, or where his breaker box was in location to the flooding in his garage. Now, we're not going to talk about any one person, but your dad
Right.
does live on the waterfront. He is
Yep.
elevated. And so thankfully, it was only his garage that got
Right.
flooded. But do you want to talk about what you saw? The storm hit on Thursday night, Friday morning. What did you see?
Yeah, so I get a call Thursday night at 10 o'clock, and it's my mom, and I'm like, uh-oh, that's not good, because I think everyone in our area, 3 or 4 days before the storm actually hit, it looked like it was heading toward the Tampa Bay area, and then it kind of jogged to the west. And so I think everyone just had a sigh of relief, right? I didn't see people evacuating. I didn't evacuate. I'd never even crossed my mind. And I think most people were like that. I went to the gas stations, plenty of gas. Went to Publix and Walmart, groceries on the shelf. It was like another day, right? And so I think that the majority of people stayed here. And so when I get a call from my parents at 10:30 on a Thursday night, we don't typically talk at Thursday night at 10:30 because we're both past our bedtime, right? So I get the call. My dad calls me, and I knew that their garage was filling up, and I'm like, uh-oh. And I was worried about the water getting to a certain point where could it catch on fire. And I said, let me, conference in David. So me, you, David, and my dad are all on the phone trying to figure out if, can we flip the breakers, because we didn't want to have power there to catch a fire. Ironically, across the street, across the waterway from my parents' house was a house on fire. And so we're sitting there, my mom was watching that. So that is a scary experience. I'm not going to lie. I was definitely worried. David, I appreciate you really trying to provide some just structure to the conversation. And I think it helped my dad too. It's just, it always feels good to have a third party kind of come in and either confirm or deny what you're thinking. But being able to, luckily, the water didn't get up to the breaker box. It started to recede later in the night. And unfortunately, they've got some damage in their garage. They lost all their cars, as I alluded to earlier, but ultimately their house is going to be okay. It was about 7 or 8 feet above the sea level, and it was just enough. By the skin of their teeth, it didn't hit the first floor. But on Friday, on Saturday, and Sunday, I spent times hopping around, dealing with different friends that had flooding, right? And so I got a chance to kind of see who flooded, who didn't flood, who kind of flooded. And the common theme that I noticed, David, throughout all of that was that these were friends that lived on the water, and they lived in one-story homes, right? And so we were bailing out furniture of one house because we're waiting for the flood claims adjuster to come in and evaluate everything. So everyone's taking pictures of furniture and clothes and receipts and stickers on the back of, leaf blowers and things like that. But it was something that, it was not, it's tough, right? It's tough going in and it's hot and sweaty and everyone's moving stuff in and out and it's smelly and it's mildew. You can just smell it. My heart goes out to my friends and just people I've seen, because ultimately I didn't get flooded, David, and I was able to go help as much as I could. But then I clocked out, right? And I went home to my bed that was warm. It wasn't flooded. I was able to cook a meal. I was able to wear my clothes that weren't mildewed. And this is just the start of the nightmare for these folks, is that now they've got to go to the storage unit. And what do you do, right? Like, there's no manual that says, well, my mattress got wet, but how wet did it get? Do I throw it away? Will it dry out? There's no manual as to like what you're supposed to do with each piece of furniture. Will the furniture dry out? Will it not? Should I throw it away? Will my insurance cover it? Right. So I know all these questions. Everyone's is going to become a flood insurance expert as to what it covers, what it doesn't, how much does it cover. So I spent all weekend, Friday, Saturday, Sunday, driving around, looking at not only my friend's stuff, but my own stuff as well, too. I looked at 7 or 8 of my rental properties. I talked to tenants in 5 or 6 of them. And if you were on the water, more than likely, you definitely took some damage. However, if you were inland, you weren't in a flood zone, which is where most of my rentals are. Most of the rentals that we own together, at least, for this, I think we got lucky. So what about you? What did you see on your side, David?
I'm going to talk about the storm actually for a minute, and then I'll talk about my observations. Hurricane Ian that hit Fort Myers 2 years ago came in as a Category 5 storm and hit Fort Myers with wind, rain, and everything in between, right? But observationally at that time, the first few, obviously the waterfront properties directly on the beach, and then let's say go back half a mile, definitely catastrophic damage. But a lot of it was from the wind,
Yeah.
right? The difference between Hurricane Ian and Hurricane Helene was that the storm was 125 miles off the west coast of Florida. And so we weren't impacted really at all by the storm, right? What this storm and what makes this storm different. So we're going to start off with our personal observation. There is no damage whatsoever to any roofs, fences. Yep. Most of the trees are standing. No real wind damage anywhere around. There's a little bit here and there, but not serious wind damage. What my observation is that as the storm, and this was a Category 4 storm, there's what they call a dirty side of the storm, which is where the storm is whipping around, and it's usually to the eastern side of a storm, is pushing water away from itself, right? And so it's pushing water up against the west coast of Florida, right? And into Tampa Bay. And so this kind of almost acts as a rotor, almost like rotating water into the coast. And so what was different about this storm is like storm itself during the day, It was a little bit windy. It was a bit fun running around and kind of running down and seeing the higher tides and stuff like that. But the poor people who lived in direct waterfront or what was insidious about this storm was it was a silent killer. It
Yeah.
came in, it crept into their house like smoke. You know what I mean? It just came in, it engulfed their home, engulfed their street, engulfed their neighborhood. It rose for 5 feet inside their house, or 2 feet inside their house, or 6 inches inside their house, depending on the elevation. And then just as quickly as it came, it left and it was gone, right? And so the observation is there's different types of storms. This was almost an entire flood event. This was not a wind event. So it's important
Yeah.
to remember that, because
Yeah.
as we go through this conversation, I want you to understand that very little damage to houses, trees, fences, roofs, or anything in between. So that's a really good thing. However,
Right.
any house that was in an area that is anyway impacted by storm surge was affected in some way, shape, or form, and that is what we're going to discuss, right? We're going to discuss the kind of the bigger implications, right, about what is the built environment look like. And so I live here in the St. Petersburg area, and there are some low-lying neighborhoods that are in this city. And then you live in the Tampa area, and there's some low-lying neighborhoods in the Tampa area. The
Right.
irony is that a lot of the low-lying areas here in the cities are quite wealthy, right? And in those low-lying areas, there observationally are two types of homes. You have the homes that have been built in the last 6, 7, 8, 9 years. They are on the water. They are usually $2 million and above. They're elevated. So they got the pool on the ground floor. They got maybe a garage, parking, all that kind of utility space on the ground floor. Then they got a staircase up to the home, and then the living areas on the first floor and the second floor. Those homes, by and large, have little to no damage in them,
Yeah.
except for in that ground floor garage. And that is what happened to your father.
Yeah.
He lived in one of those nice homes with a garage on the ground floor. And, there is evidence going forward that if you do live in that environment and you have an elevated home, maybe you should go and park your car in the Walmart car park if
Yeah.
there's a storm like this. But that is a mitigation component, and we will talk about that later. So most of the homes that are elevated were saved, okay, from the storm surge. Then dispersed in these neighborhoods tends to be these 1950s block homes. These neighborhoods were originally built, all of it was 1950s block homes. The newer homes are on lots where they came in, they bought an 1950s block home, they knocked it down, and they built this beautiful property on it. Okay. Now, there are probably, dependent on the neighborhood. In the wealthy neighborhoods, maybe 50% of these homes are new and elevated. And then
Right.
50% of these homes are 1950s block home, and they're at grade. They're essentially at sea level. So
Yeah.
when water comes in, there's not much, tolerance to flooding. You'd agree with that, Clark, right?
100%. Yeah. It.
All right.
Yeah.
So with that being said, it's important to understand the people who are in the 1950s homes in these flood-prone areas. Not only were they damaged this time, but they've been damaged before.
Yeah.
Right, in many cases, and that's like pretty serious. That we're going to talk about. If you've been damaged before, that's happened before. Let's talk about what they can do going forward, right? But it's just important to understand right away that there are two different types of homes that got damaged here. So, Clark, who got flooded, who didn't get flooded? Now, I've just discussed the kind of wealthier, low-lying neighborhoods here in the cities,
Right.
right? But there's a whole different animal of
Yep.
flood-prone homes that are out in the more rural areas, that are up on
Yep.
the Big Bend and the Panhandle and the more rural
Right.
areas. Do you want to talk to the listeners about the more rural areas? Because I don't want to just focus in on the Tampa Bay area.
Yeah, and out to just piggyback is that I saw when I walked down my parents' street, right? And to your point exactly, it's like 2/3 beautiful new build houses, stilts, the whole 9 yards, but their garage are obviously on the first floor, or you had a 1950s block home, and it was very evident, right? If you had the 1950s, you were guaranteed to flood, and you could just see the back door and the front door open. You could see right through the house and just hauling stuff out, right? Versus the people that had the built up house, they were inconvenienced because there's a palm tree leaf, or the flowers are all messed up and their cars were messed up in their garage. But obviously a different experience trying to figure out how to fix some baseboards in a garage, or dealing with your car insurance people, versus an entire house that's been flooded. Now, the strategic advantage to that is that if you bought 4 or 5 years ago, David, you're in a highly desirable area, right? So your dirt is still worth a lot. However, if you are in, there was a lot of publicity, a lot of coverage in Big Bend, which I didn't even know was called Big Bend, Horseshoe Beach, and some of these places that I've never even heard of before. And the reason I haven't is because of the fact that there's just not a lot of people there. There's not a lot of attractions, things like that, other than just it's going to be little beaches, little kind of mom and pop restaurants, little bars, little marinas, things like that. But also, too, is that there are places farther north of us, even in areas that we've bought a lot of houses in like Port Richey, Florida, Hudson, Florida, Crystal River, places like that, where the values of these properties are not $1 million. They're not $2 million, So there's majority of the houses are still those 1950s block homes, 1970s block homes, but they are in a flood zone. And so the thing about it is that because there's not as much growth in these areas, there's not as much on stilts, basically, or they're raised. So the majority of the homes, let's say in Big Bend, the majority of the homes in Hudson, Florida that are on the water are still these very low-lying 1950s block homes. And they are taking it in the chin because of the fact that it flooded, which then creates a problem of, do you have the ability to look at other things, other strategies? Maybe you want to rebuild, right? But if you don't have enough money to rebuild because the value of the land isn't that great, because it's in an area that's less desirable, there's just not as much stuff there, there's not as much demand for the area. What do these people do? So
Yeah.
that is something that we certainly, I feel for those people, because if you bought a house 6 years ago, there was a 1950s block house and you were on Treasure Island or Madeira Beach and near St. Pete, more than likely the value of the dirt itself is worth more than probably what you paid for it. It still sucks. You still have to deal with mildew clothes, but you do have the ability to look at other options. Someone that's sitting in Big Bend in an old frame house that got completely flooded, and maybe it was only worth 200,000 or 250,000. Your options are much, much less. And I think we should talk more about that here on this episode.
Yeah, you know what? I'm just going to give you a quick observation before we move on, right? Number one, you've got two different types of flood zones. You've got tidal flood zones, and that stuff that's basically salt water is going to get into your world, all right?
Yeah.
That's usually within a few blocks, either of a beach, of a canal, or of a storm drain. So if you've got the whole city and it's pouring all of its excess water into a storm drain, and that storm drain overflows, you're going to get flooded by fresh water in that scenario, or you get by rainwater, um, as opposed to if you're on a beach or you're on a saltwater canal, let's say, and you got a boat out your backyard and you go out into the Gulf of Mexico every weekend, that's going to be a storm surge, right? And so it's important to understand. So you just mentioned Hudson, Florida. I've been buying for about 10 years, just north of the Tampa Bay area, and I have been buying strictly in non-flood zones for 10 years. And just from a personal basis, I have been offered hundreds of homes on the west side of Route 19, and I bought virtually none of them. I could have made money. I could have sold them. They'd never flooded before, but I never wanted to put my clients in that risk, right? So I bought everything in the non-flood zones, and that was just a hard rule for me. To my knowledge so far, not one of my homes or my clients' homes have been damaged. There is choices that we can make. Now, another one is, even you might be in a non-flood zone, but there might be elevation on your street. And so if you're at the bottom of a hill and you get an inundation of rain, where's that water going? It's going down into the bottom bottom of the neighborhood, right? And if the storm drain at the bottom of your neighborhood is not adequate or blocked up, all that water in your neighborhood is going to start, backing up. And where's that going to hit? It's going to hit your house if you're at the bottom of a street. And so that's something that I've always been pretty careful with as well with my clients, or even, I'd have an opportunity to buy a house. And I was like, it's at the bottom of a street. Stopwatch is right twice a day, right? The chances are not zero of these things. And so I was always very careful. It's like, I'll pass on this one, even though I could make money. I'll pass on this one. I don't like what I see here. But look, we were talking about the types of homes that we observe, right? We've talked about the wealthier neighborhoods. You just talked about the kind of more rural neighborhoods. I'll just give you a quick personal example. In that, there's a neighborhood north of here called Crystal River. Absolutely beautiful, right? And if you go around those, it's all canals built into the Gulf, right? And if you go around this in your kayak, you'll see three different types of properties. You'll see the 2.3 million and above home, elevated, the ground floor is garage, exactly what we've just discovered. You'll see that. Then you'll see the old frame home that, the person that owns it, they're not spending a penny on it. They're never renovating it because they know it's going to flood. And so it's all this kind of almost like, don't want to use disparaging language, but it's almost like this hillbilly vacation home style thing, where they still use it. They're still up there at the weekends. They still Airbnb it. They still rent it out. But nobody spent a dime on this thing since like 1957, right? Because they know this house is going to flood. And then the third type of property that you see as you're, kayaking around these neighborhoods is the lot that has nothing on it at all, except for maybe a boat dock and maybe a little bar with the gone fishing sign and the couple of bar stools. And then people will use it as their weekend vacation. They'll get their RV, they'll come up, they'll spend the weekend on the land. But then when they're gone, because they know this place is going to flood. So then they take their RV and off they go. And the most they're going to lose is the bar and the boat dock that they've got. And that's okay. That's all right.
A travesty. We don't want to lose that bar, David.
Unfortunately, yeah, they've probably been hanging out that bar for like 25 years, but they will lose it eventually. And they know it. So like 2/3 of those neighborhoods are already built and prepped for a flood, right? They already know. So they're either not spending money on it whatsoever, and they're just one day it'll just get bowled over, or it's vacant already and they just use it as a vacation home. Or if they're going to sell the dirt, somebody's going to come in and build a $3 million home on it that will withstand all of this, right? But Clark, here's something I've been scratching my head on, right? I was just talking about, I have been for 15 years very strict about not buying in flood zones. And just full disclosure here, a lot of people have been asking me, a lot of people have been asking you, how did you get on? Everyone we meet is like, are you okay? Every single conversation, are you okay? Did you flood? And I say, no. I said, my house is not in a flood zone. I just haven't been buying homes in flood zones. I'm just very aware of the topic. Again, that's all I'll say, right? But I'm glad that I had that approach, right? I'm glad that I love living here, right? So anybody listening to this thinks living in the Tampa Bay area is not super amazing to live here may misunderstand or misinterpret this conversation, where you're like, okay, well, at least we don't have to deal with that. There are mitigation processes that you can put in place here where you never have to think about these things. So that's what we're going to talk about now. Mitigation. So it breaks my heart when you see homes that have flooded before and they flood again. I'm like, could you not have spent the last 2 years figuring out how to, what you can do to prevent your house from flooding? Because, since the Middle Ages, people have been building flood defenses. People have been building and preparing for inundations. The Dutch, the country of Holland, is below sea level. How did a country hold back the North Sea, right? There's people who live all over the Middle East that live on marshland, right? Humans have been engineering their way out of flood risk for millennia. And how are we sitting here today with today's technology, ingenuity, and ability to manufacture flood mitigation defense systems, even just for your own house, and nobody's using them? So number one, there is like this L-shaped flood barrier, the foot is longer than the barrier itself. So it's an L shaped with the bottom of the L being longer, and it simply uses the concept that the weight on the L on the bottom is more than the weight on the flood prevention part on the upper part of the L, and it just prevents floods. Now these things are about $145 each. They're about 3.5 foot wide, or 4 or 5 foot wide, 4 foot wide. And so if you were to put these all around your house, it would cost you maybe $7,000 or $8,000 to buy this flood defense, but it would protect your house indefinitely, right? And you can build that, and you can dismantle it, put it in storage. If there's a storm coming, that's a great thing about storms. We generally know 3, 4, 5, 6, 10 days beforehand, right? A whole neighborhood could get together and say, look, we as a block can build these around the neighborhood. You buy them on Amazon, right? We could put this around the whole neighborhood. We could club together. We could build it together. We could pay for it together. But there's not that social cohesion, that joined up thinking, that we can protect our block. Well, first and foremost, you can protect your house. Then you can protect your block. The technology is there. It's freely available. You can buy it on Amazon. It breaks my heart when you see this happening over and over again, and people are not collaborating, and people are not working together, and the city is not working together. The insurance companies are not working together. FEMA is not working together. The federal government are not working together. To just say, okay, what would it take to provide each of these owners or these neighborhood associations the technology to protect their own home? Because at the end of the day, Clark, and this is where we're going to go next in this conversation. You own a home. If you're buying a home now, and you're buying it in a flood zone, in a tidal flood zone, a lot of people tend to think, well, the flood insurance is like an extra $2,000, right? But flood insurance is not there the night that your home is flooding.
Yeah.
It doesn't put a value on the urn that your grandma is in. And I'm going to give you a little story. On Saturday morning, we have a house that we're just putting on the rental market, right? And obviously, the rental demand is just bonkers after the storm, and we're going to talk about that in part 2 of this conversation. But there's this lady and her husband. They were 52 and 54. Their house burned and flooded at the same time, right? They were in an evacuation A zone, so they were in their home after being told that they should leave. The house burned down. Why? After an evacuation is called, why do the power companies not shut down power to these neighborhoods so these homes can't go on fire when they are flooded? So if there's a 6-7 foot inundation on the way and they know it, to leave the power as a municipality, to leave the power flooding into those neighborhoods, I have to ask myself the question, how does that even happen? Because on Saturday morning, this lady was inconsolable. Everything she's ever known. They were starting off, they didn't have toothbrushes. They didn't have underwear. They didn't have socks. All that they had was the sweatshirt that they had on them, right? Everything else in the world, they need to start off from scratch. Now, they will get insurance money. They will get this and get that. And we're going to talk about that in part 2. But it was so preventable. There's so many things that could have happened before we had this lady. And my wife, Catherine, was just like hugging this lady for an hour on Saturday morning while I, talked to the husband and got them all sorted. They're thankfully now a safe, almost new build, gorgeous home, and they get to rebuild their lives. But Clark, from here on out, we've been talking about before the storm. And for the next part of this conversation, we're going to talk about after the storm.
I want to hit on one thing, David, that you mentioned, and because you're talking about personal mitigation efforts, and you've got 2 things. You talked about trying to literally stop the storm, right? Which is a huge deal. I just want to hit on is that, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. We've already banged the drum on flood zones and what the repercussions could be. I know driving around St. Pete, Florida, I know driving around my own parents' neighborhood where everyone that was on the water, whether you were in a 2-story, on stilts, or you were a ground floor concrete block house, you still took damage either way. However, 2 blocks back, Nothing. It was like you wouldn't even have known there was a hurricane hit. Literally a block or two back from my parents' street that was probably up a little bit higher, not in a flood zone, didn't get anything. You wouldn't even know a storm came. So that was a little bit eye-opening to see. And as I drove around and looked at a lot of my rentals not in flood zones, a lot of the city is not in a flood zone. I think a lot of people think all of Florida is just like sitting in some swamp, right? And it's not. There's so many places that are higher up. So if you can be proactive going forward, right, kind of staying out of flood zones. But you mentioned something earlier about the bottom of the street, which is really important. So being able to not buy at the bottom of the street kind of makes sense. I own a first townhouse I ever bought was at the bottom of like the townhouse complex. And guess who caught all the rainwater every time and walked through like 2 feet of water to get to my
I bet
car?
you did.
It was super fun. It's super fun, like rolling your, taking off your shoes and socks, rolling up your pants. And guess what? It hasn't changed one bit. And whatever tenant, I still own it. Whatever tenant's there gets to experience that fun thing. But one more thing I noticed too is that I have a duplex where it's not in a flood zone. However, the actual physical building is lower than the street. Okay. So the area around there is not in a flood zone at all. But my specific building is because it's lower than the street. So keep that in mind when you're looking at stuff in the future. It may not be in a flood zone. I don't care if flood zone or not. But if your physical house is lower than the street,
Right.
guess where the water is going to go? Guess what gravity does? It pushes things to where it goes
Right.
lower. So keep that in mind when you're looking at things in terms of, are you at the bottom of the street? Is your physical building lower than the street itself, flood zone or not? Let's just take that and put that on the shelf. And then obviously being able to avoid flood zones. So I just wanted to kind of focus on the prevention part of it. I know you can't get in a time machine and go back to your house that you bought that's maybe lower than the street or at the bottom of the street in the neighborhood, or it's in a flood zone. But those are just some things that I want you to take away from this conversation.
Well, what you can do when you are ever considering buying a home anywhere, doesn't really matter where. This is not as you say, only like 97% of this city is unaffected. They're all just back to work and going about their day, while other people are pulling, sodden mattresses out of their houses. There's such a juxtaposition, and that's kind of the sad part. That's what we're talking about here, is that there's like this, 3 or 4 or 5% of the city is just in a world of pain, and 95% of the city is just back in the gym and going about their day.
Yep.
I was like, why? Why is this happening, right? And a simple thing you can do, no matter where you are in the country, by the way, because look at Asheville, look at Atlanta. This is not just a Florida thing. And if any of the YouTubers are out there saying, oh, Florida's become uninhabitable, that's very misleading. What you can do, an actionable tip right here, is you can order an elevation certificate when you're buying any house anywhere in the country. Where is this home in relation to the elevation? Now, you could be living in Denver, right? 5,000 feet above sea level. You're like, this conversation's irrelevant to me. It's not.
Right.
It's not irrelevant to you because you have rain, surge, you have ice, you have melting ice, you have all sorts of various water channels and attenuation ponds. And if you're at the end of a street in Denver and all of the water in your neighborhood is running down into your house, you're 5,000 feet above sea level, but your house can still get it. So always look at the topography of the home. Don't buy the lowest home in your neighborhood. Buy the highest, and then order an elevation certificate if you're anywhere, in a low-lying area.
One last thing. Here's a cheat code on that. Very simple. Just go on Google Map and go look at, whatever the street view is. And if there is sand or dirt that's collected in front of your driveway, more than likely it could have rained a week ago, right? But it dumps all the dirt right there on just a normal rainstorm. So if that Google map shows that there is, because it's hard to tell sometimes on Google which way the street leans, is your house above or below the street. But guess what? Mother Nature will dump that dirt right in front of there, and you'll see where it keeps staying there because every time it rains, it just leaves this, and it'll leave like a mark, right? And you can see it. That's a sure sign that there is constantly, you're at the bottom of something. And if it's going to get to a really bad storm or even worse, a hurricane, you're going to be the first person to see all the damage.
That's right. That's great advice. I've used that one myself a lot. If I go online and I see, sand outside my house, I'm like, that's a puddle that keeps on showing up there, it keeps on drying there, and that's all the dirt from the street, drying out right in front of the house. All right, Clark, we've been talking about the before the storm mitigation and things like that. Now we're going to talk about after the storm, and what the landscape looks like after a storm is hit. What does it look like? What do we do?
Let's do it. David, the storm is hit. We wake up the next morning. Obviously everyone's clearing out their house that flooded. There's obviously going to be a lot of dominoes that are going to fall, that are going to compound from the effects of this storm. So let's jump right into those, David. Talk to us about kind of the first thing that popped into your head that you saw. Hurricane blows through. What happens now?
Well, first of all, like we said in the first part of this podcast, is that 95% of the city is completely fine.
Right.
So,
Us included.
life kind of bounces back, and it's not, abundantly clear yet exactly what's happened, right? We know, or we hear anecdotally, that the barrier islands, that would be, Madeira Beach, the Indian Rocks Beach, Longboat, Siesta Key, Anna Maria Island, St. Pete Beach, all these places, right? We would have expected that there would be an extra layer of damage down there because we knew there was storm surge coming. But the very first thing that I noticed by 7 a.m. the next morning, right, is that my phone is blowing up, absolutely blowing up, from all my previous Airbnb guests that have stayed with me before during previous storms, blowing me up saying, David, do you have anywhere to stay? Do you have anywhere to stay? Right? And that becomes abundantly clear that accommodation is going to be a really, really big problem.
Right.
And I'm going to tell you why. I'm going to tell you what a little bit of nuance here is. In the last 2 to 3 years, a lot of hotels have come online in the city of St. Petersburg. And the city of St. Petersburg has a 30-day minimum for Airbnbs on the books that was never enforced on any great level. It was always just, that's there to at least give the city some enforcement if there was a bad actor in the Airbnb space, that they could, shut them down. But we've had some, what I call code enforcement vigilantes. As the price of houses went up, as the price of rent went up, and as these new hotels came on stream. And I have a conspiracy theory that these hotels are actually paying code enforcement vigilantes to go ahead and expose Airbnb operators in the city, of which there were about 3,000 to 4,000 Airbnbs in the overall city of St. Petersburg, right? Well, for the last 2 years, the city has been responding to vigilantes. And I call them vigilantes because they live nowhere near these homes. And yet they're taking it upon themselves to, right the wrong of high house prices or high rents. Somehow, some way, Airbnbs are responsible for that. And so the city and the media are getting behind this. Yeah, shut them all down. They're bad operators, these party houses. Well, guess what? Really, from an operator's perspective, guess what's really going on with an Airbnb, Clark? The vast, vast majority, and I mean the vast majority, I'm talking about 95% of Airbnbs here in the city of St. Petersburg are used for people who are doing local people who are doing renovations on their home, right? In ordinary times. People who are in town for extended medical or cancer treatments. So because there's a lot of hospitals here, right? The people are in town for that. People who are having their houses tented over a 4 or 5 day period, right? And they've got, family, they've got pets. You can't bring your family and your pets down into a 260 square foot hotel room with a $65 a night resort fee in it.
Yeah.
Right? So this idea that somehow hotels are the option. And then the other huge observation is that when a storm hits, or any other kind of, let's say storm, right, hits, there's a requirement immediately for, in this case, tens of thousands of furnished rentals available. The city of St. Petersburg has been shutting them down. And so these storm affected families are scrambling. All of their furniture is wet. all of their clothes are wet, and yet there's very few Airbnbs left. And you know, as well as I do, that the city, you know, at least 10 people who've gone to you and said, city shut me down.
Yep.
I can tell you right now, the city shut 9 of mine down, right? The city shut lots of friends of mine who are doing Airbnbs. They're all gone. So what happens when a storm hits? Where are these people going to go? I don't know, right?
I don't
So
know
the
either.
very first thing that hits that becomes apparent is that where do we send these people?
Right.
You know, these furnished homes, where are they? So we get together with a bunch of real estate people, Clark, and I start looking at everything I've got, even things that I'm like in between, you know, renovations on, or
Right.
things that I've got. And I'm like, you know, I just use it personally or whatever. We're just collating information against all the other rehabbers, flippers, you know, landlords, and everyone else in between. Right, our industry kicks in and starts trying to find places. And so, you know, I called a friend of mine who I know uses a house as a vacation home, doesn't rent it out. I call him in Chicago and I said, listen, can you rent your house out? You know, and he had a back unit and a front unit. He's like, sure, I'll rent it out. And so I, as I said, as I mentioned earlier on, I took some long terms and I put them immediately out, you know, just kind of like, okay, it's not perfect, but it's ready to go.
Right.
And so the very first thing is Airbnb fallout, right? My point here is that if your city has this, it's not a political approach, but if your city has this anti short term rental approach, just know that there are unintended consequences when you tar every Airbnb as being some sort of party house or a hotel on my street. The argument is a lot more nuanced than that, because every city has different needs for different things. And so, you know, humans who are in between housing, people who are here for a month, and just while they get themselves ready to find somewhere, hotels are not the solution. I'm married with 3 kids and a cat. You know, am I good to go to a hotel? So my very first observation is the unintended consequences of Airbnb closures over the last few years are really profound, and they're real. I've written letters to the mayor of the city and to the city council just saying, when the next storm hits, you know, there's going to be this problem. I wrote to the mayor and the city council again last week, and I got a big old donut in response, just like I did the last time.
Right.
So if you are listening to this and you have this, you know, anti short term rental lobby in your town, I just hope no natural disaster or anything like that ever comes by. You never fire, there's never a storm, or that the people in your city who do need occasionally when they're doing a renovation, or they're tenting their home, or they're visiting your mom and dad, and you've got 5 kids, and mom and dad's house isn't big enough to stay in, right? These are the people who use short-term rentals. So my first, don't want to bang on about it, but you know, my very first observation was, wow, there's just not enough. There's not enough supply anymore for this demand, and so you know we get together as a group and as an organization, as an industry. But Clark, we're still trying to help people. We're still
Yeah.
trying to find homes for people right now, and there's so much demand, and they're all banged up as families of 5 sitting in a 1-bedroom hotel room right now,
Right.
thanks to the city. All right, what's
And
the other like
and
a day later, Clark? What's the other observations?
here's another thing too on that is that you may be listening and saying, well, the easy thing for you use the city of St. Pete is for them to just, wave their wand and just erase that rule, right? Okay, Airbnbs are allowed for the time being while we sort out this mess, right? However, the problem is that it doesn't work like that. You don't just unwind it and be like, poof, problem solved. Because guess what? Now all those Airbnbs that got shut down. Well, what did you do, Dave? You told me about. Well, now I've got all this furniture sitting in storage somewhere,
Right.
30 miles away, right? So it's
Yep.
not like you just send them over to your vacated Airbnb that was sitting there. Now there's no furniture in it, right? And a lot of people have either sold it off, given it away. It doesn't have a lot of, the resale furniture market isn't super hot, right? So a
Yeah.
lot of times you just give it away or throw it to Goodwill, right? So now if you've owned an Airbnb, furnishing an Airbnb is not easy, right? It's expensive. You got to think, you got to put some thought into it and the themes and blah blah blah. Are you going to go out and buy $8,000 to $10,000 worth of furniture so for 1 year's worth of rental? Like that doesn't make sense. So once you create that law, you don't just unwind it with a magic wand, right?
Right.
So I just want to kind of put that in. Next thing, David, is all of these flood zone houses. The question that everyone is sitting here thinking about right now, that's sitting out in their front yard, sitting in their dining room set on the grass in the front yard, is once I hopefully get this flood money, if I had a flood policy and I paid it and they do what they say they're going to do I want to rebuild and put the house back the way that it was? Or do I want to just knock it over and build something? Or do I want to sell it probably to like a developer, right? And, it's a question that a lot of people are facing right now. And
Yeah.
is this going to create a kind of like a new construction boom? Because I think that the thing to think about is that let's just say that you don't have the money to build a beautiful new raised 2-story on stilts type house or bring it 6-8 feet off the ground. Do you know if you don't have the money to do that, do you want to spend all the time, blood, sweat, and tears putting this house back together so they could potentially flood 2 years down the road, 5 years down the road, whatever that looks like, right? That's what my parents are facing right now. They're like, okay, we kind of dodged a bullet, but do we want to go through this again in fill in the blank years? It may be never, it may be 50 years from now, the next flood, but it could be next week. You don't know that. So, how much energy and emotion do you want to put into having to put it back together for the potential that it just floats away again 2 years from now? So, I think that my prediction is there's going to be a lot of development either by the homeowner themselves because they want to live in this brand new 3,000 square foot, beautiful. Who doesn't want to live in a new house on the water or close to the water, right? I certainly wouldn't mind that. Or do they not have the expertise? Do they not have the energy to do that? And they'd rather just sell it to a developer that's going to come in and build something that at the end of the day is not, it's not flood proof, but when you're 12 feet off the ground before you get to your first living floor, you
Right.
may lose some lawnmowers and some may have to deal with some car insurance claims, but it's not going to be a total disaster, right?
Right.
So it's going to be interesting to see in terms of the demand for new builds, so for developers, for builders, for all the trades that come in that need to put in that drywall, that need to lay that slab, or that foundation, what that looks like. And I
Right.
think too, and David, I had a buddy call me that's in that same scenario. It's like, before I just like take this money and blindly put the house back the way that it was, maybe I need to look at like, could I just build new? Do I have the money? What would the mortgage payment be? What would it be worth? Like, how much is a 4,000 square foot house on the water right now in my area? It might be worth $3 or $4 million, right? So I gave him the advice. Said, well, the numbers don't lie, So I want to help him put together. Okay, if you take the 200,000 to put this house back together, your house will be worth X. You'll have it, it'll look nice and new, but it'll still be a 1950s with kind of low ceilings, and it's not like the most amazing thing in the world, but it's still a beautiful view and it's got a new kitchen. Or do you want to go through the hassle of what you have to move out? It's going to take probably 2 years now to build something like that, if you're anywhere close to the water where it's raised up at a minimum, right? So now you're out 2 years. Okay, now you got to go rent for 2 years. You said people have kids, dogs, cats. David, I know that your 18-year-old cat, Chloe, who I've watched for 2 summers in the past, probably wouldn't want to sit at a Marriott right
Right.
now. I can't see Chloe doing that. So it's going to be interesting, but I do predict that there's going to be an interesting domino effect of new construction coming
Right.
down the pike.
Well, Clark, I've been saying this to anybody who listens well before this storm, right? So be very clear. One can talk about global warming. Like, was this storm the result of it? Was all this extra water that came in? Because most people who stayed in their homes have experienced 25 storms before. And I've heard this time and time again in the last week. It's like, this one was different.
Yeah.
I've heard that so many times. This one was different. And so, was that a 1 in 100 year scenario where a storm just caught it at high tide and we
Right.
were on the dirty side of the storm, or so on and so forth? But here's something I have said for a long time. Florida is going nowhere, right? Florida is Still 1,000 people a day moving down here, right? Over 360,000 people moved here last year. Okay. What is happening on the ground? And listen carefully, right? People are not fleeing Florida because of storms or fleeing Florida because of floods. People are building different types of homes.
Yeah.
And there is a process underway right now that if you have a home that is not elevated and it's not newer, built to kind of the newer Miami standards, that home will eventually be replaced. And there is a new home construction replacement boom going to be a feature here in the state of Florida for the next 25 years. What I have said for a while is every home that's in a low-lying area that's not at least 12 to 13 feet of elevation eventually is going to sell for its lot value.
Yeah.
The house will have very little value. The lot value. So if I was advising your friend who woke up and was going to get a $200,000 insurance, I would say, well, what's the lot value of my home? Because you said, well, you know, you get the, let's say the value of his home is 875. Who's going to buy a house, a 1950s home that's flooded twice in the last 3 years
Yeah.
at any price? What's the price of it? I
Right.
don't know how to value it. I do know in the last week, I've had an opportunity to buy at least 50 homes,
Yeah.
right? And I'm like, I don't know how to price this. So, you know, I'm out. But I do know how to price the lot value because I can look how much that lot's worth, how much it's going to take me, what it's going to cost me to build a new home at an 11, 12 foot elevation. So it's out of the floodplain. I do know that number. And so over the next 10 years, people are not going to leave Florida. People are not going to, you know, flee these neighborhoods. These neighborhoods are going to get knocked down and these neighborhoods are going to get rebuilt. And the question right now is to our pre-storm discussion, which was, do we do something to protect those neighborhoods? Right? Does the city come in? Does FEMA come in? Do the insurance companies come in? Do they enforce those neighborhoods to be kind of elevated? So you can take these block homes and elevate them. It's an amazing piece of engineering and it's expensive, but something has to get these homes off the elevation. So will there be a new construction boom? Without a doubt. Without a doubt. If you are a licensed general contractor, get your ass to Florida because you're going to be busy for the next 25 years building new homes all over the state of Florida. Nobody's leaving the state. People are just going to be living in newer, more applicable homes to the times.
Yep.
Another question, Clark, will there be a foreclosure boom? Right? So will people walk away from homes? If you have a $700,000 home and you owe $600,000 on it and you get $200,000 in insurance, which is more than the equity you have, do you just take the equity? Do you just take the insurance check? Get your $200,000, go inland, go to Lennar,
Yeah.
put 50 grand down. You got yourself a new 4-bed, 3-bath in a nice neighborhood with a pool, right? You pocket 150,000 and then let the other home go into foreclosure. Is that going to happen? Yeah, that's going to happen lots. So if you're in the foreclosure business and you're okay with buying these homes at lot value, i.e., you're a developer or you're a wholesaler, you're going to buy these things at lot value. Yeah, I see a lot of that. But the advice that, you know, we have been giving people is number one, keep your emotions out of it, right?
Yep.
As an owner, you've been flooded. Were you flooded before? Is this the first time ever? Okay, this is the first time ever. Okay, you're in bucket A. Have you flooded 3 times before? Okay, you're bucket B. That's a different scenario, right? Then you get the question, okay, well, do I renovate? Do I rebuild? Do I knock it down or do I sell? Right? And every single person will have to answer that question personally
Yeah.
and to their own, you know, financial means. Do they want to, you know, they could take the $200,000 for the renovation. They can then get a loan if they don't have another loan on their home. They can get a loan and put another, let's say, 250 on top of that because it costs about 400 to 450 to build a decent home at elevation. right?
Yeah.
So we're not talking about the $1 million homes here. So around 450, they can build another home. These neighborhoods are beautiful in
Right.
an elevated lot. Not in that scenario, they that would be a wise move that I would think. But either way, all of these homes are going to get elevated, sold for lot value, rebuilt, or you will obviously get the people who've lived there for 35 years. This is their first time flooding, or it's even their fifth time flooding. They're not moving. They're not going. And I'm always amazed at that American grit, that like, I'm not moving. This is a Monty Python scene. This is, it's a mere cut. You know what I mean? This is a skin cut here. So I'm just amazed always at that grit where it's just like, nope, you know, last night was terrible, but we get up
We'll
today
get
and we
through it.
rebuild
Yeah.
and we move forward. And to those people, God bless you. And, we're here to help in any way we can. Now, here's one thing that struck me this time. What do you think is the obligations of the city? So a lot of people in neighborhoods that have never flooded before flooded this time. And what it was the storm drains. So we normal neighborhoods to flood are the low-lying areas or the beaches. But this time areas inside the city that were essentially in flood zones because they were near storm drains. And the storm drains didn't hold up. So I think that cities and the federal government really, really need to think, is the infrastructure in these places fit for purpose? Or do we just go and let all this happen again? Because there's a lot of
Right.
human, just like it might be insured and it might be this, but like there's a lot of human disruption. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like the kids are off school because their house is flooded. My kids, I went into school on Monday morning. My kids go to a school in a place called Shore Acres, which is all low lying. And the teacher looked at me. She goes, are you okay? Did your house hold up? I went, we don't live in a flood zone. And I was like, you, like, did she? And she's like, no, I live out of town. I'm like, cool. And I said, how about the other families? And she's like, 70% of the parents this morning have come in with their kids and said, yeah, our house is all flooded.
God,
So,
that's awful.
Clark, what do you think is this, like the obligations of the cities, and the federal government here? What do you think is their responsibility in the future? Because we're talking about going forward here, not going backwards.
Yeah, I mean, there's always going to be, opportunities for grants. I'll be very brutally honest is that you were just talking about the 70% of the families at your kid's school. And I, I don't want to have to rely on the city to improve the storm drain, and I think it's something where you need to take it into your own hands and control your own destiny. And if you don't have the means to be able to, knock down a house and be out for 2 years and you're displaced and then your kids have to move schools and your dogs and cats and everything, I really think that it may be time for a change. And I think a lot of people are being faced with this task right now. And it'll be interesting to see the migration patterns. Now, these are very like sub migration patterns, right? Like these are being very different, almost city to city within Florida, right? But it will be interesting to see where the migration are. People going to move to say, you know what, maybe living on the water is not, the juice isn't worth the squeeze anymore. I'd rather not have to go through this, and I'd rather move to a lake, or I'd rather move to, just inland and be able to get a little bit more bang for my buck. But I don't know where the city is going to kind of step up, if they're going to provide grant money, if they're going to change some of the infrastructure. But I'm not interested to wait and sit around and see what they do. I think that you listening, it's you're going to have to take some action. And if they do improve the infrastructure around you to where it minimizes the risk of flooding, then great, and that's icing on the cake. But I wouldn't bet on it, and I wouldn't wait for it. And I don't know how you
Right.
feel about that, David, but that's to me. I'm not willing to wait for my local city government to make drastic changes.
Right. Well, I think rather than bailing out the insurance companies time and time again and bailing out individual owners time and time and time again, I think it's time now to have an honest conversation on a governmental level and a FEMA level where the government just issue low interest rate loans so that these families can come in, raise their home above grade. So, number one, it fixes the insurance issue. So
Right.
anybody who's in a high hazard area, they get to raise their home and retrofit their home for storm and wind, right? So if the government were to give low interest rate loans, so it's not a grant, it's not a gift, it's a loan, right? And retrofit homes and raise the homes in the state of Florida where these high risk homes are, I think that that would literally put an end to all of this discussion, all of it
Yeah.
going forward. The insurance problem would by and large be fixed. That's a multi-billion-dollar problem every year. Would it
Yeah.
not be better to just have to provide, instead of bailing out insurance companies and continuing to have to deal with these emergency issues, wouldn't it be better just to issue low interest rate loans to these owners and then give them the expertise and the architectural expertise, the planning procedures, so that the city is not saying no at every, because you know as well as I do, we build new in the city. Like this, the motivations of your local city are always to get bigger, get more property taxes. And I don't know, I can't speak for every city, but the adversarial nature of planning in most cities is just outrageous. So what I think the government need to do is they need to connect a couple of dots, give these owners low interest rate loans, require them to raise their homes and to retrofit their roofs with hurricane straps and hurricane windows, and then provide the architectural and planning fluidity to remove friction so that they can do this at scale in the entire state of Florida, and not just Florida, North Carolina, South Carolina, California. You know, what can be done by giving owners low interest rate loans? I just think that that's the actual solution. And but there's one thing that's been really bugging me, and I got to get it off my chest. And we made a disclaimer at the start of this conversation that we're not here to gloat. We're not here to be sensationalist, but we are here to observe and here to talk about it. And one of the things that really, really breaking my heart on one way and making me mad at the other is, you know, I can see for so many people, the wealthy people who live in these neighborhoods, they can handle this, right? They're like, yeah, we've got insurance. We've got enough money to stay in an Airbnb for a year while we sort it all out. It's not the end of the day. But for a lot of people, particularly older people, retirees who live in these homes, in these 1950s block homes, the lovely neighborhoods, and they love their neighborhoods and they like their neighbors and they like everything about it. So I'm not here to criticize any of that. But there are a lot of people who moved into these homes in the last 2 years, the last 3 years, you know, young families. Rather like we discuss on this podcast, you are the result. Your life is the result, by and large, of the choices that you make. You've heard the term before, choose your hard, right? Choose your hard. Be smart. Make wise decisions, right? This is what the Burn Your Boats podcast is about. And so I am scratching my head here in that, for me and for all of my investors over the years who have ever asked me, is that in a flood zone? Because I can tell you, if I put a home out over the years in a flood zone, I would have zero interest in it. If I put a home that had, because I've been preaching this for a decade or more. And if I put a house that was in a non-flood zone, I could sell it 500 times over. And so I'm scratching my head here saying, where's the education? Where is the disclosures? You know, now I know that if a home is flooded before, a seller has to disclose it, right?
Right.
But where's the education, particularly young families and young homeowners that made these decisions to move into these very leafy, they're very emotionally beautiful neighborhoods. But unless you can afford to essentially live in these places, Clark, you really shouldn't. And so my conclusion is this, and it's a kind of a larger conclusion, is that we get to choose where we live and we get to choose how we live. And living in Florida is a blessing. It's an amazing place. 95% of this city bounced back on Friday morning, went to work, cleared some twigs off their lawn, you know, or maybe some little branches, which I had to do. Some little branches around my lawn, bang, was done in 6 minutes. And then other people are pulling themselves out of. And it's kind of a bigger metaphor for everything that you achieve in your life. If you have your health and you have circumstances that allow you to have a productive life, right? So you're not looking after a sick parent, or you're not looking after 10 children. If you have the time and you have your health, you are the result of your choices. And so, in conclusion, I'm driving through these neighborhoods on Tuesday morning, and my heart is breaking. I made a video about it. My heart's absolutely breaking, but I can't help asking why. That's my conclusion, is that, we have choices, and surely those choices should be better made for people who cannot afford to deal with the reality of waiting for an insurance company and, slopping out their home and taking drywall out in the middle of the night. So that's my conclusion, is just, it's sad, because it's, in my view, for the people who live in the waterfront neighborhoods, they're gorgeous. And the people who live there and they live in these elevated homes, yeah, they're inconvenienced for a little bit, right? They might lose their classic cars, right? But for the people who can't afford it, I kind of ask myself why. So what's your overall conclusion as we wrap up?
I like your idea about the fixing the problem and not the symptom, right? The symptom is better flood insurance, getting the guardrail things that we talked about earlier to keep the flood from coming in. But that's a symptom, right? That you're protecting something that's a problem, and that's being in a flood zone on a first floor house, right? And being able to provide not grants, like you said, not handouts, but being able to educate and provide potentially low interest loans to be able to get people to get their houses to comply. So regardless of if a flood comes through, you are good to go, and you're just going to have to figure out how to be able to pick up twigs and berries that have broken in the yard, which is not a big deal. So now I'm kind of wondering, David, is that the platform that you're going to run on for office? Is this an episode that we're launching the run for some sort of government office, which you would last 5 seconds in before you'd probably go crazy, like most entrepreneurs. But I do like that approach of fixing the problem, not fixing a symptom of the problem. But then you have to follow the money, and we could go into a whole thing about, well, who benefits? A lot of people benefit when you've got a bunch of flooded houses, and who can pad their pockets, which is a whole nother episode, right? But I feel for everyone. I went around and I helped some people out this weekend, and it really saddens me. But we can't fix, you listening to this, you can't fix something that, a house that you bought yesterday and it flooded, but you can fix the decisions, to your point, what going forward, right? And if you can educate yourself and maybe minimize your risk by buying in more specific areas or buying a certain type of product over other, that is something that you can impact going forward. So hopefully in this episode, it stimulated some thought, right? It stimulated some things to be able to make you think, okay, I can't fix what happened, but I sure as hell can fix what's going forward to minimize my risk. So David, this was a tough episode. It's tough to hop on right after a storm, but hopefully our listeners got something from this, and our hearts go out to everyone that's been having to deal with this, and their lives have been turned upside down. And I request that if you're listening and you need help, or you need access to a certain type of construction crew, or a certain type of underwriting to figure out what's the next step. Do I take that money and put it into the house? Do I sell it? Do I do this? Please reach out to us. We'd love to help you out in any way we can to provide guidance. We've got a lot of different experience, a Rolodex of just vendors, and we have access to people that have Airbnbs, and we have access to a lot of different things that your typical person may not, because it's our industry that we're in. So please feel free to reach out to us. Contact at burnyourboatswealth.com. Reach out to us on all our social media, Burn Your Boats Wealth. And with that, keep your spirits high, everyone. And we thank you for listening, and we'll see you next time. Well, that is a wrap for today, folks. We hope that this episode shed some light on the complexities of the real estate market and kind of really gave you some actionable insights. Because remember, you navigate the world of property investment, it requires more than just luck. You're going to need strategy, you're going to need knowledge, and of course, you're going to need a little dash of courage. And if you enjoyed today's episode, be sure to hit that subscribe button. Leave us a review on any of the podcast platforms that you listen to, and YouTube as well. And don't forget to follow us on Instagram and Facebook at Burn Your Boats Wealth. and leave comments. Talk to us about things that you want us to talk about or things you disagree with us on. We appreciate all that type of insight. Your support really fuels our fire to bring you even more valuable content. So we appreciate you. We appreciate the support, and we will see you next time.
You've been listening to the Burn Your Boats podcast with Clark Lunt and David Shaw. We would love to hear from you. Please reach out at burnyourboatswealth.com with comments, questions, and if you have a topic you would like Clark and David to discuss on an upcoming episode. We would very much appreciate it if you took the time to rate and review Burn Your Boats podcast on your favorite podcast listening app, and make sure to follow and share on social media. Content in Burn Your Boats podcast is for entertainment purposes only and is not legal or financial advice. Please review our legal disclaimer at burnyourboatswealth.com. Thank you for listening.